Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing good today. Today, I'm going to present to you a little bit on detective fiction. In this presentation, you will be listening to me talking about the history of detective fiction, the formula or the structure of detective fiction, and some thoughts that I hope can get you start thinking about detective fiction deeper. Okay, and now let me start by showing you this image of Agatha Christie, the queen of detective fiction, who wrote 66 novels during her career as detective author during the golden age of detective fiction. As I mentioned to you earlier, I will be talking about the history, the formula, and some thoughts on it. Now, about the history, let me start with this brief overview of how detective fiction came to popularity. It all started in the 19th century, around the second half of the 19th century. It rose at the same time as the rise of legal trials. What is so special about legal trials? In the past, during the age of kings and queens, decision on whether someone is guilty or not was made by the king. It was a monarchical decision. If the king says that someone is guilty, then this person is guilty. If the king says that someone has to be punished, then the person has to be punished. Period. It's as simple as that. However, after the fall of the monarchy and the rise of the bourgeoisie, people cannot decide the guilty person in such an easy manner. Okay, there has to be a system to do that because there's no more king who holds the absolute power. So there is the legal system. The legal system has judges, has prosecutors, or they have defendants. And for a prosecutor to decide that someone is guilty, well, this person has to find evidence, has to find witness, and has to find some logic or reason, has to be able to convince people that this person is actually guilty. And that was when detection started to happen. If somebody is reportedly or somebody is reported to have done a crime, then the judge has to decide whether this person is really guilty by showing the evidence, by finding witness, and by providing, offering the logic behind the crime. So the detective fiction started at the same time as the legal system also started. It also happened at the same time as the Industrial Revolution took place. That happened in the 19th century. During the Industrial Revolution, many people started to move to cities, and cities became, well, densely populated. When a lot of people live in the same place, well, problems start happening, okay? And so was the case in the Industrial Revolution. Crime rate increased in big cities like London, New York, and so on. So they started, well, legal systems and started law enforcement units, and so on. The NYPD, as we now know it, started in the 19th century as well. And that's also when people started to become more interested in finding stories or in reading stories about crimes and how crimes are solved in cities. So that's the general history of detective fiction. It started in the 19th century. At at the same time of the Industrial Revolution and the fall of the monarchy. Now, let me give you some, well, overview of how the genre detective fiction evolved into what we now know as detective stories. First of all, it all started with the model detective. The first modern detective as we now know it is probably C. Auguste Dupin from Edgar Allan Poe's stories. There are 3 stories about this character that you might be interested in reading. These stories were published in the 1840s. They talk about how a very smart person named C. Auguste Dupin solves mysterious cases known as closed room murders. Murders in a closed room where nobody else has seen. So C. Auguste Dupin is a person who can solve such mysteries. If you're interested in this, I recommend Murders in the Rue Morgue, what else? Purloined Letter, and what is the other one? Oh my God. I will give you the information later, okay? I forget the third short story to read. That's way before the word detective came to English dictionary. Back then, there was no such word as detective. So this is the model detective, not even named as a detective. Now, the real detective started in late 19th century with stories by Wilkie Collins and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. From Arthur Conan Doyle, we know Sherlock Holmes. And from Wilkie Collins' stories, we know, I forget the name, okay. But basically, this is the period when actual detectives started to appear. And most of the detectives were male, if not all, okay. All of the detectives were male at the time. And these detectives are often modeled after C. Auguste Dupin. Even in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's first story about Sherlock, the study in Scarlet, the helper, in this case, Dr. Watson, even compares Sherlock to C. Auguste Dupin. So that's how important C. Auguste Dupin is. Although at that time, he wasn't called a detective yet. And then the third period is the golden age of detective fiction in the 1930s. That's when Agatha Christie started to come to popularity, okay? She became popular with her works and her characters. One of them is Hercule Poirot, whom we're familiar with from stories like Murder on the Orient Express. Yeah, I showed her picture earlier in this presentation, right? So this is the time when, well, I will tell you more about these detective characters later on. But basically, this is the golden age of detective fiction, where we find super brain detectives in stories. After the super brain and smart detective, we have the age of hardball. Hardball stories have usually, well, interesting dialogues and unusual detective characters there. So these are basically the 4 periods in detective fiction. And we stopped here in mid-20th century. What about the later detective? We will find out later. But mostly nowadays, we don't have the actual detective character, but most like spy characters like James Bond or intelligence characters, people from the intelligence units. Okay. Now, let me give you a more overview of the 4 periods. First one, in the model detective, we find an extraordinary solver of mysteries, but not yet called a detective, in the character of C. Auguste Dupin. So C. Auguste Dupin is somebody who is very smart in math and many other fields of science. And he manages to use his knowledge to solve cases that he doesn't actually see. And the next one, the beginning of the genre, during the time of Wilkie Collins and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, we see exploration of crime and the establishment of the detectives. The extraordinary detectives are now here seen, and we can find more crimes in the story. And it became even stronger during the Golden Age, where we can find the perfection of the genre. During the Golden Age of detective fiction, there was even something called the 10 Commandments of detective story that showed us that the genre was established and there are rules in the genre. And here is also where we can find the closed room crimes becoming, becoming an established genre. Closed room crimes are crimes that happen in one place where nobody else sees. Okay, so the detective, to solve the crime, has to use everything they know, everything they have learned in life, and all the brain power that they have to find the answer to the mystery. And after this era of perfect detectives, smart detectives, we came to an age of the hard-boiled fiction, in which we find problematic detectives, detectives who like drinking too much, smoking too much, or having problematic relationships, deal with more serious crimes that don't only involve bad people, but also people who we consider good in societies, like politicians or police officers and leaders in the society. So this is a problematic genre. I mean, this genre has a lot of problems that make us readers think over and over to find the answer of the crime. Okay, so these are the 4 periods that we will be covering in this semester. Now, what about Batman and, in the Batman and Selena Kyle here? Some people have said that the new Batman movie is a detective movie. Now, what kind of detective is Batman? Or which detective from which period is he? Is he from the Golden Age, or from the beginning, or from the hard-boiled? I will leave the answer to you. Try to find out what kind of detective Batman is, or what kind of detective story Batman is, the Batman is. Next, now let's get to the formula. Basically, in any detective story, we have these 3 elements: the crime, and then the attempts to solve the crime, to solve the mystery, and the revelation of the mystery. These are 3 important elements in detective stories that you can always find. And during the Golden Age of detective fiction, Ronald Knox even proposed this 10 commandments to make people not make mistakes in writing detective fiction. You can pause and read these 10 commandments and see how established the genre was back then in the 1930s. Now, let us talk about the types and elements of detective fiction. According to Svetlana Todorov in an essay published in 1966, there are at least 3 types of detective stories. This is based on Todorov's observation of detective novels that he had read back then. The first one is whodunit, the second one is thriller, the third one is suspense. Whodunit is when the story starts with a murder and the rest of the story will be the attempt to find the murderer, okay? So that's what the whodunit, that's why it's called whodunit, to find out who has done the murder. So starts with a murder and continues with the revelation of the murder and the murderer. The second one is a thriller. It starts with something and it makes you excited about what is going to happen. And at the end, we have the climax of what happens. It either ends with the murder or the prevention of a very serious murder. That's a thriller. The third one is the combination between a whodunit and the thriller. So at the beginning, there is a murder, but then as stories goes on, you will find more murders or more crimes. And at the end, it climaxes with one big thing, which is either the prevention of the murder or the biggest murder. So this is basically a combination between the two. Now, if you see the Batman, I'm not going to spoil the story, but it's basically comes down to the, well, find the answer yourself. It will be nice to see the answer from you. Okay, now in any detective story, basically, according to Svetlana Todorov, there are 2 stories. The first story is about the crime, about what actually happens when someone is dead. Okay, what actually kills the person, or who actually kills the person, and how the killing happens. That's the first story. The second story is the detection or the attempt to find out either about the murder or the murderer. Okay, this is how the author presents the story to the reader. So basically, there are these 2 stories in any detective story. Now, let me give you some well, details about whodunit that I have actually mentioned earlier. Yeah, it starts with a murder, and then it continues with the story, the detection of the murder. And in this kind of story, we are moved by the curiosity to find who actually has done the murder. So curiosity is what drives us in this kind of story. The second one, thriller, it ends with a murder. And it starts with something that makes you, well, curious about what will happen. But it's less about curiosity and more about suspense. You are always in anticipation of something that will happen, because there is an indication in the beginning of the story, and then there's a bigger indication somewhere in the middle of the story. But then, there is the climax of what the story is at the end. So this is a thriller. It starts with something that makes you anticipating something, and it ends with either a murder or the prevention of a murder. It moves more with suspense. It keeps you in suspense all the time. Now, let us go to some thoughts offered by some authors about detective fiction that I hope can make you think deeper about the genre and make you start thinking about the possibility of exploring the genre deeper. First of all is what Ernest Mandel offers in his book, Delightful Murder. first thing that Mendel offers is that detective fiction shows a shift of interest from natural death or anticipated death, like death from old age or sickness, to accidental or unwanted death, like the death from murder or crime. It shows people's interest in this kind of death. Now, why are people interested in this kind of death? It's related to the fear of people, the fear of death. Why are people afraid of death? Well, as you know, not all societies in the world are afraid of death. Some societies see death as a bridge to the next stage of our life or our existence. But for the bourgeoisie, death means only the separation between people and their wealth. If people die, they can no longer have their wealth. So that's the end of it. And because of that, people are afraid of death. And this fear eventually manifests in their interest in reading stories about death, particularly unwanted death. And that's how people got interested in detective fiction. People's interest in detective fiction is inseparable from people's fear of their own death. But it doesn't only indicate bad things. It actually indicates something which is quite acceptable. What is it? It shows the change of the society from the monarchical detection of crime, as I mentioned to you earlier, to the more, well, democratic detection of crime. Detection of crime in the past was made by the kings or queens, but now detection of crime or decision of someone's guilt is made by a group of people in the legal system. Yeah, in general, it's basically a bourgeois genre. It is related to the fear of the bourgeois class of death that they don't want. The second thing is a comparison between detective fiction and chess, according to Scott McCracken. So in his book, Pulp, Reading Popular Literature, Scott McCracken offers that detective fiction and chess are basically quite the same. How are they the same? Well, first of all, they have a lot of similarities. The first similarity is related to the number of players. The game of chess always involves 2 players, and detective fiction always involves at least 5 players. The detective, the helper, the victim, the witness, and the criminal. You can always find these 5 players in detective fiction. And in both areas, one movement decides the next. If you make a mistake in this step, then the next step will be affected as well. And there are conventions in both games. In the game of chess, you have the rules that you cannot break, you cannot change. And in detective fiction, you also have rules, just like what I showed you earlier from the golden age of detective fiction. But there are some differences, such as the unfair victory. In the game of chess, anyone can be a winner if they can get the best of the other, right? While in detective fiction, it's always the detective that wins, so it's unfair. And in detective fiction, we have, well, super brain detectives, people with high brain power that can solve murder cases. While in the game of chess, they are just ordinary human beings who happen to be good at anticipating what happens next. All right, I guess that's all for now. And I want to end this presentation with this person, Edgar Allan Poe, which I mentioned earlier as the the person who created the model detective, C. Auguste Dupin. Now, if you're interested, well, actually, I want to require you to read Murders in the Rue Morgue to show how the detective genre started. All right, everyone, I guess that's all for now. And I hope you're excited about what you will be reading for next week. Bye.